Illinois was once a French colony whose strategic value in the 19th century soon made it a commerce hub that attracted millions from around the world and made many people filthy rich. Since then, it has continued to play a crucial role in American history. To see why, join me for this brief look at the history and politics of Illinois. The earliest humans to inhabit the area were hunters and gatherers who roamed the southern part of the region 10,000 years ago. Over the next several thousand years, cultures developed that built permanent villages and depended primarily on the growing of corn. By the year 1300, the Mississippian culture, a highly developed society based on the raising of corn, squash, and beans, dominated Central North America. This society, the largest Native American culture north of Mexico, built large fortified cities and extensive earth mound monuments, the largest of which was found at Cahokia, the culture's religious center, located in what is now southwestern Illinois. The single largest surviving example, a massive structure known as Monk's Mound, was built around 1050 AD and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. By the time Europeans arrived in the New World, a large number of Native American peoples that relied on agriculture and buffalo hunting for survival, and which belonged to the Algonquian language group, inhabited the region. Among these were the Kickapoo, Sauk and Fox in the north, the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwa near Lake Michigan, the Illinois, a confederation of 5 peoples in the central prairies, and the Cahokia and Tamaroa in the south. Their life would change with the appearance of Europeans, the first of which were the French explorers Louis Joliet and Jacques Marquette, who showed up in the area in 1673 as their expedition traveled south from Wisconsin, following the Mississippi River system. On their return, they would veer east and become the first non-natives to see the Chicago River. This first group did not establish any settlements in the future state. Instead, it would be René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, and Henri de Tonty who would found the future state's first European foothold when they built Fort Crèvecoeur near the modern city of Peoria. De La Salle and Tonty would then follow up in 1682 with Fort St. Louis near the modern city of Ottawa. Neither would last very long. Both would be abandoned and then rebuilt elsewhere as a result of indigenous attacks. Further settlements, missions aimed at trying to convert the natives to Catholicism, were built in Cahokia in 1696 and Kaskaskia in 1703. The French called most of this territory Pays d'Illinois, Illinois country, itself named after the Illini, a group of indigenous tribes. The French were not the only European power interested in the territory, however. Throughout this whole period, France was engaged in a struggle for control of North America with the British, and in 1763, after losing the 7 Years' War, were forced to cede all of their North American lands east of the Mississippi to the British, including the entire future territory of Illinois. Still, this did not result in an influx of British settlers. Only a few months after the British victory, King George III issued a proclamation that forbade settlements west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to gain favor with the native allies. This led to a significant decrease in population, so that by 1773, the number of Europeans in Illinois were only around 1,000, about 100 of whom were enslaved people. In 1774, future Illinois officially became part of the province of Quebec, but this new setup barely lasted as the American Revolution exploded within a year. As part of the conflict, George Rogers Clark led a Virginia militia into the region and captured the British settlements at Kaskaskia and Cahokia in May of 1778. American control of the area was then confirmed by the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war in 1783. Soon, what to do with the vast territory would become an issue in Congress, with several proposals being voiced, the most important of which was one by Thomas Jefferson. Finally, Virginia, along with Connecticut, gave up their claims on the newly acquired lands, and Illinois became an unincorporated part of the Northwest Territory in 1787. During this period, one of the area's few settlers, a free black man, probably born in what is now Haiti, Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, built a farm at the mouth of the Chicago River, the first non-native to do so in what would eventually become the Windy City. As settlers hungry for land began to populate the Northwest Territories, the future state would be reorganized several times. First as part of a new Indiana territory in 1800, which lost most of Ohio and the eastern part of the lower Michigan Peninsula, and later as a separate Illinois territory, which included parts of modern Wisconsin and Minnesota, in 1809 with its capital set in Kaskaskia. Still, the territory's original inhabitants were not so excited with the arrival of the newcomers, and for the next 3 decades or so, there would be constant conflict with American authorities. As a response, the U.S. government built several forts in the future state, including Fort Massac in 1794, a reconstruction of an earlier French fortification, and Fort Dearborn in 1804, a garrison in what is now Michigan and Walker in downtown Chicago. It also tried to buy land from the natives through treaties like that of St. Louis in 1804, where future President William Henry Harrison negotiated the cession of about a third of modern Illinois. Neither of these actions stopped people like Meatpacking, a leader of the Potawatomi, from raiding settlements in the territory, however. The War of 1812, a conflict with Britain over trade disputes, exacerbated tensions with natives in Illinois even more, as some of them allied with the British. This led to one of the most notable native attacks in Illinois history, the Battle of Fort Dearborn on August 15, 1812, when a group of Potawatomi Indians burnt down the fort, killed 52 people, and captured 41, several of whom would later be ransomed. The attack convinced the American government that natives needed to be removed from the area, and their victory over the British in 1815 accelerated this process. Still, there would be one last major confrontation with indigenous people, the Black Hawk War of 1832. Although some leaders of the Sauk and Fox had ceded their lands to the United States in 1804, others refused to leave. Black Hawk, a leader of these people, was driven into Iowa in 1831, but crossed back over the Mississippi River into Illinois the next year with about 1,000 followers. At first, he and his people had some success against the Illinois militia, but the lack of supplies forced him to retreat northward into Wisconsin, where most of his followers were killed and where he would be captured in August 1832. The devastating defeat and death of most of Black Hawk's people, including women, children, and the elderly, convinced the surviving natives to leave the state. The other long-term consequence of the war was that it began the political career of multiple important politicians, including 3 future senators from Illinois, Sidney Breese, James Semple, and Orville Hickman, as well as 3 future presidents, Zachary Taylor, Jefferson Davis, and one Abraham Lincoln. The gradual dispossession of land from the natives encouraged settlement in the area, especially after the U.S. government promised potential War of 1812 recruits that if they enlisted, they would be granted plots in the territory. And thus by 1819, the Illinois population had grown to around 35,000, enough that Congress granted it statehood, after dividing the original territory into 2 so that 2 roughly equal-sized states could be constructed. Statehood came with a constitution, a very liberal one for the time. Not only did it allow all white men to vote, but it did so without any property requirements or even demand that they be U.S. citizens, just that they live in the state for 6 months. It also severely restricted slavery in the state. The capital originally remained at Kaskaskia, but as settlers populated the center and north, the capital was first moved to Vandalia in 1820, and then, after the Black Hawk War, to Springfield in 1839, a much more conveniently located seat of government. Even as this was happening, there was already another more important city developing in the state, Chicago. People recognized very early the value of its strategic location between the Great Lakes system and the Mississippi River basin, so that already by 1840 it had doubled the population of Springfield with nearly 5,000 people. Once the Illinois and Michigan Canal was built in 1848 so that the Chicago River was connected to the Illinois River, meaning bulk goods could travel from New Orleans to New York via Chicago and the Erie Canal, population exploded. Within 20 years, it had over 100,000 souls, while Springfield remained at less than 10,000. It also helped that in the early 1850s, railroad connected Chicago to the eastern states, so that by 1856, it was the country's most important railroad hub. This was not the only boomtown in the state. Galena, an area originally inhabited by the Winnebago Indians, attracted money and people to its lead mines, which at their height in 1852 produced 87% of American output and 10% of the world's. There was also Nauvoo, a town that was bought in 1839 by the Mormons after they fled from persecution in Missouri. Their leader, Joseph Smith, intended to make the town a haven for his followers and soon attracted some 12,000 people, making Nauvoo the largest town in the state by 1845. Because of his connections with John C. Bennett, the Illinois Quartermaster General, the state legislature granted the new town much autonomy. Nonetheless, non-Mormons did not like the newcomers very much, and soon the same tensions that had existed in Missouri developed in Illinois. As the conflict grew, Joseph Smith was detained by Illinois authorities and placed in prison in Carthage to face trial for treason against the state. On June 27, 1844, however, an anti-Mormon mob broke into the prison and killed him and his brother Hiram Smith. Left without a leader, his followers became divided over questions of succession, leading to a schism that produced 3 different churches. The largest, under the leadership of Brigham Young, left Nauvoo in 1847 for Utah. Meanwhile, during this period, the country itself became split over the question of slavery, making it a major theme in local politics as well. Illinois had been born as a free state, but as early as the 1820s, there was an organized effort to permit slavery in Illinois. Edward Coles, its second governor, an early advocate for the rights of black people, fended off the attempt, and in August 1824, voters rejected a pro-slavery referendum. Then in 1848, a new construction was written which abolished slavery and made it illegal to bring slaves into Illinois. Then, after the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, whether to allow the expansion of slavery into new territories became the national question, and one of its main opponents came from Illinois politics, Abraham Lincoln. A lawyer in Springfield that began his political life as a member of the Whig Party, Lincoln first gained national prominence in 1858 when he engaged with Stephen Douglas in a series of debates over slavery that took place in each of Illinois' 7 congressional districts. Both men were trying to gain the favor of the Illinois General Assembly so they would be sent to the U.S. Senate, but in the end the legislature opted for Douglas. Nonetheless, Lincoln's profile was raised to such an extent that he became the Republican nominee for president in 1860, an election he won. The South viewed this as a catastrophe, given his views on slavery, and began to secede even before he took office. Less than 40 days after the beginning of his presidency, the Civil War began. Illinois played a prominent role in the conflict. Although no major battles took place in the state, it provided 250,000 troops to the Union cause, making it the 4th state with the most enlisted men. This included newly resident of Galena, Ulysses S. Grant, who would of course go on to become the winning general of the war and then president in 1868. That is not to say that the state was unanimously for the Union. There were calls for Southern Illinois to secede, and residents of Marion actually did pass a secession resolution in April 1861. Nothing much came of it, but their secessionist streak remained somewhat. After the 2020 elections, they passed a referendum to secede from the state, along with several other counties. The post-war years led to much prosperity and the inauguration of major education centers, including the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 1867, Southern Illinois University in 1869, and Loyola University in 1870. Economic growth stemmed both from the state's transformation into a major manufacturing center for all sorts of things and the coal mining that fueled it. Coal was especially important in Southern Illinois, while barbed wire was produced in DeKalb, plows in Moline, stoves in Belleville, and heavy machine building equipment in Aurora. The manufacturing epicenter was Chicago, however. Its strategic location helped it become dominant in iron and steel production, lumber distribution, and marketing of produce. Despite a fire in October 1871 that lasted over 2 days, killed more than 200 people, left 90,000 homeless, and destroyed $200 million worth of property, the city continued its explosive growth. 2 commercial innovations in particular helped Chicago maintain its edge. The first was the invention of a mail-order business, basically the original Amazon, with the creation of Montgomery Ward in 1872 and its competitor, Sears Roebuck, in 1892, both of which operated via catalog. The other was the invention of the refrigerator car in 1878, which revolutionized the shipping of beef, making Chicago a slaughter and meatpacking center, and Gustavus Swift, the head of a food empire that lasted over a century after his death. City density was also helped by an innovating construction technique known as balloon houses, prefabs that allowed houses to be constructed more quickly, and of course the invention of tall and super tall buildings, more commonly known as skyscrapers. The first one was built in 1882, a 10-story edifice known as the Home Insurance Building. Illinois' industrial expansion attracted foreign-born immigrants and emigrants from other parts of the U.S., including Poles, Hungarians, Italians, Czechs, Russians, and African American migrants, among others. Although welcomed by industries hungry for workers, immigrants and migrants alike were shunted into segregated neighborhoods, a dynamic that would be a main feature of machine politics in the 20th century. The manufacturing boom also brought labor strife to the state. Starting with miners and later railroad workers upset over low wages and unsafe jobs, labor unions were organized to fight for better working conditions and safety, especially because there was no accident insurance. An injury was considered the worker's fault. These led to several violent events, including 1877, 1886, and 1894. The first occurred when, after a railroad strike went national, labor in Illinois decided to join, bringing the state to a standstill. As crowds gathered to protest in Chicago, and the police were sent to disperse them, violence followed. Known as the Battle of the Viaduct, the result was some 30 workers dead and hundreds wounded, including 13 cops. The second happened when, at a peaceful protest demanding an 8-hour workday at Haywood Market in Chicago on May 4, 1886, a bomb was thrown at advancing police trying to disperse the crowd. The cops then responded to the explosion by opening fire on the crowd, killing at least 4 civilians. In the aftermath, authorities charged 8 men with conspiring with the unknown bomb thrower and executed 4 of them. The hysteria and heavy-handedness of the case gained notoriety worldwide, paving the way for May 1st to become International Workers' Day. The last one occurred in the summer of 1894 when workers went on strike to demand better wages and reduce rent from the Pullman Company. The U.S. Army was eventually called in to stop it, resulting in some 70 deaths and the arrest of one of its leaders, Eugene V. Debs, the same man who would later found another important union in Chicago, the Industrial Workers of the World. Unfortunately for the state, violence would not be limited to this period. In the next 3 decades, Illinois would be rocked by race riots where whites targeted and killed black people in Springfield in 1908, in East St. Louis in 1917, and in Chicago in 1919. The Ku Klux Klan then continued terrorizing them in the 1920s, although their targets in the state expanded to include Jews and Catholics. This version of the Klan became so popular in Illinois that they had among their members state officials and had complete control of many towns in the state. Their popularity was in part because they advocated for order in a world with vast demographic change and the loss of Protestant power, and because they supported Prohibition, which was initially quite popular. Prohibition also brought violence, however, both with the Italian Mafia in Chicago, whose notoriety would make it a staple of popular culture in movies, books, and music, and also in southern Illinois, where the Shelton Gang dominated in the early 1920s, but was then beset with a bloody war with Charlie Berger, a rival faction. The state was hit hard by the Great Depression. Coal mining saw serious decline in southern Illinois, and Chicago's manufacturing base severely contracted. By 1933, this sector in the city had shed 50% of the workforce it had in 1927, leading to huge unemployment, as high as 50% of the African Americans at its height. The economic collapse, along with the New Deal, helped the Democratic Party end Republican dominance in the state and transformed the mayorship of Chicago from a competitive office to a Democratic stronghold. It took World War II for the state to return to a more prosperous path as manufacturing turned to the war effort. As it happens, Illinois also helped bring the conflict to a close, not only because of the nearly 1 million people that served in the armed forces, but also because it was at the University of Chicago where the world's first controlled nuclear reaction occurred, thus paving the way for the atomic bomb and the end of the war. The post-war years brought an economic boom to the state, although coal mining never quite recovered its glory days in southern Illinois. The new prosperity also reinvigorated machine politics in Chicago, especially with the arrival of Richard Daley, who ruled the city with an iron fist for over 2 decades, and by extension significantly shaped state and national politics as well, most famously in 1960 when he helped Kennedy narrowly defeat Nixon in Illinois, the edge he needed to win the presidency. Because Daley's machine rested on enforcing racial segregation in the city, however, when factions within the Democratic Party began to side with civil rights activists and against Vietnam policy, he did everything he could to oppose them. That became a major issue in 1968 when the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago and Daley sent his forces to suppress anti-war and Civil War rights protesters. This was captured live on TV, making the nomination of Hubert Humphrey look like complete chaos, and no doubt contributing to him losing to Nixon a few months later. The 1970s brought an economic recession and painful deindustrialization, closing the few coal mines that had survived in southern Illinois after the 1950s. It also brought a new state constitution in 1970, which solved a problem that had been developing for years, the extreme difficulty to amend it. While in the next few decades the state would have a major imprint in the country culturally and politically, as it produced shows like Siskel and Ebert and Oprah, as well as bands like Chicago and Smashing Pumpkins, and of course, Barack Obama, it would also become embarrassingly associated with corruption. Between 1970 and 2011, 4 of its governors, 3 of them Democrats, would be prosecuted for corruption, and dozens of additional politicians would also be found liable. This made the governor's office generally competitive, but at the presidential level the state remained solidly blue. As the state continues to be transformed in the 21st century, Prosperity has been uneven. Parts of Chicago and southern Illinois remain disproportionately poor. The state has also lost population compared to other states. This remains a massive challenge and will shape the state's decades to come.